Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I'm so excited to be co-hosting this event with the Welcome Center. I know we have a whole lot to talk about, so I'm not going to speak too much, but basically the structure of the session will be Robin, then Will, then Michael, then Megan. Is that all right with everyone as far as an order goes? And so I think we'll just take all the talks back to back, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the attendees. Thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to everyone for coming. It's lovely to see so many faces from so many parts of my life going so far back into my history. This Lancet Commission is an extraordinary thing that Katrina and I had the privilege to become involved in. Essentially, initially we were make-weights because this started with a GW4 collaboration that was headed up by Jane Blaseby at Bristol. She's a consultant oncologist there. And if you don't know, GW4 is a funding mechanism in southwest of England, and it needs collaborations between 4 universities: Bath, Bristol, Exeter, and Cardiff. And they had 3. They had a lovely man called Malcolm Johnson from Bath and Jenny Kitzinger from Cardiff, but they needed somebody from Exeter to make up and get the money. So Katrina and I got kind of fingered to do it by one of our colleagues, David Pension. And it turned out just to be the most extraordinary and the most wonderful experience to be part of this Lancet Commission, which was chaired by Richard Smith, who used to be the editor of the BMJ, and more famously is the brother of Arthur Smith, stand-up comic. And Richard has desires to be mistaken for Arthur, I suspect. These Lancet Commissions are really extraordinary things. They're usually collections of anywhere between 30 and 40 academics, practitioners, professionals, clinicians, and Lancet writes about them. They say that it's a program where they work with academic partners to identify the most pressing issues in science, in medicine, and global health, with the aim of providing recommendations that can change health policy or improve practice. The first one was in 2000, and it's a hugely influential piece of work on climate change, the impact of climate change on health. So it was a really extraordinary opportunity for us to work on this commission. But even more remarkably, I think, is that it gave me an opportunity to write about philosophy in the context, as Will has pointed out, of a really, really glossy publication. I mean, Lancet is high gloss. The idea that, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, and certainly this is what our editors at Lancet have told us, is that there's been no commission which has really had a kind of anything like a philosophy component to it in the past. And I have to really say a huge thank you to Richard and also to Libby Salno, the co-chair, who pushed for this philosophy to be a major part of it, and in particular also pushed for the systems, the death systems idea to be a major part of it. And these are, so I obviously most of the philosophy work was mine, but the death systems material is work that Katrina and I have been doing for some years now as part of our Connecting Communities work. And I have the other thing that's a really big part of this work is the idea of a kind of community basis for understanding and thinking about revaluing death. And a lot of our work in that area, and particularly on the social determinants of death and the continuities between the conditions that enable living well and dying well and grieving well, we've really been hugely influenced by Lorraine Hansford's work on that. And it's really with Lorraine's work that allowed us to kind of make the transition from thinking about our Connecting Communities work to thinking about how that might make sense in the context of the Commission. And I'm hoping that Michael may talk a little bit about some of these ideas in terms of engagement later on. So we started with this intuition in a conference, a public-facing conference in Bristol, and the intuition was that death has become devalued, and we weren't quite sure. We agreed on that, but we didn't quite know how to articulate that as a research problem for the Commission. But we shared an understanding that death and the process of dying has become over-medicalized in contemporary societies, not just in Western Europe, but across the whole world. And in fact, a year into our work, or a year and a half into our work, obviously the COVID pandemic hit, and we had to stop and say, is it even worth our while carrying on with this commission in the context of the suffering and the extraordinary, just the awful deaths that were being suffered across the globe. And at the end of it, actually, we began to think that our work was more important, more valuable than ever, because our concept of over-medicalization actually fitted with what the kind of reality for many of the people who suffered loss and death during the COVID pandemic. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But part of our insight is that, and you know, I could do a thing here where everyone could put their hands up or not, but just two generations ago, it would be the norm that more or less everybody in the room today would have seen a dying person or have seen a dead person, would have been present with a dead person or have witnessed their death. And now we just don't. The majority of us in this room will not have seen a dead person, will not have lived with somebody who is dying and witnessed their death. That's because death happens predominantly now in hospitals. And we have this kind of whole discourse surrounding this idea of a good death, and there's a kind of idea that somehow that the good death is a death where one dies at home, painlessly, surrounded by one's loved ones and one's family. And we didn't really want to talk about this idea of a good death because it's kind of overdetermined in lots of ways, but we did want to acknowledge that this is not an experience that virtually any of us have anymore. That death happens predominantly in hospitals, but not just that it happens in hospitals, but the actual process of dying is itself hospitalized or over-medicalized. And so we worked to frame this as Richard says in our introduction, as a paradox, that we have witnessed a paradox about death. And that is that, first and foremost, people in hospitals, people who are dying in hospitals tend to be over-treated. And this is part of a kind of a context where every death in the hospital is seen as a failure, because the whole point of hospital care is to cure. And death, it's impossible to cure death in some sense. Well, I'll come back to that in a moment. But the whole context of dying in hospitals is a kind of insult to the kind of way that hospitals are set up to provide care. And so we see this phenomenon of over-treatment. So people's lives are extended at the end of life. Everything is done to keep people alive for as long as possible, at enormous cost to health systems because of the kinds of technology, the care, the drugs that are needed for this. But typically, this prolongation of life at the end of life in hospitals adds at most days or weeks. But more than that, the over-treatment that's involved typically leads to deaths with low dignity, with great suffering, and real distress to the dying person and also to their families and loved ones and carers. So it feels as if somehow we wanted to say the value of dying, because of this medicalization, has become skewed, and we've lost something intrinsic about what was involved in dying in communities and dying in families. We also see this extraordinary investment of absurd amounts of money by people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in this obscene search to develop a science to end aging, to somehow to cure death, to search for immortality. And it's an obscenity because it's an obscenity because of the way that these people think that they can somehow control death and everything about what that says about their kind of own sense of their own power. And we want to make a connection between that and our attitude towards climate, because the other thing that we know is that much of the work that's done to prolong end of life is actually having huge influences on the climate. We contribute massive amounts to climate. Something like 5% of climate change comes from medical care. So the kinds of money that these guys are spending, and this is the third point I wanted to make about this paradox, could easily be spent on providing end-of-life palliative care, and especially investing in opioids at end of life. There's absolutely no reason at all why everybody in the world shouldn't have access at end of life to cheap, readily available opioids, which would mean that nobody had to die a death in pain, that nobody has to suffer at end of life, that death can be relatively comfortable. But palliative care is almost unknown in low and middle income countries. And to a large extent, the only access to palliative care that is for those who are most privileged and most well off in these countries, with one exception that we spend some time at the end of our commission talking about, which is in Kerala state in southern India, where 85% of all palliative care in India is given in this one state. By the way, it's a communist state which has extraordinary figures across the board. It has the lowest COVID figures in all of India. It's actually driven by communities in which women have the highest literacy levels in all of India. And there's something really significant about the role that women play in the communities, which we can talk about as well. But one of the things that Katrina and I were really interested in is the way in which the community engagement that took place in Kerala state around end-of-life care and palliative care is almost identical in approach to how we've done our Connecting Communities work. And we wanted to try and shape a lot of the work at the end of the commission with that in mind, to think how can this case study of Kerala state be translated into other settings, into other communities, into other countries. And we think it can be done. And some of the recommendations that we make at the end of the report speak to how we think it can be done. How much time have we got? I could just stop there.
Yeah. I mean, you haven't been talking all that long if you want to finish.
I've got an awful lot to say about the philosophy, but I think in some ways I can maybe do that and actually just hand over to Will, who can talk about it so much better than I can.
Yeah, maybe
I'll do
come
that.
back in question time to.
Nice.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Robin. That was really, really wonderful. Will.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for inviting me to this event. It's a real homecoming for me. I know a lot of people in this room, and you know, memories of trudging up that hill to this campus still scar me. So that's wonderful. I have many friends in this room as well, and some friends who are on the virtual world that we've all got used to during COVID. I'm going to be talking about 3 deaths. So there were not just 1 death in this report, 3. I'm not going to say, it's a commentary on the report. I'm not going to say anything new. The report is an exceptional thing. If you haven't read it yet, I would really convince you to read it. And as Robin says, I was rather amazed by the amount of philosophy that Robin managed to sneak into this report. So there are 3 deaths I'm going to talk about are medicalized death, what the report calls, I suppose I would call it relational death. And then the third one, it is kind of alluded in the report, but I think is really important as well, social death. Now, I've gone old school, so I've written something to be spoken, but also I've done so many kind of edits, stupidly, that I'll probably get confused halfway through. I've timed it. It actually takes, say, 7 minutes, but I have this real tendency, as I am doing now, to improvise. So I'm hoping to hit this 10 minutes. So let me begin. We can distinguish between death and dying. The first is an end, and the second is a process. We can think about this end either subjectively or objectively, or, which is the same, from a first person or a third person perspective. From a third person perspective, death is an object of knowledge, whether biological, psychological, or sociological, or so on. And there are elements within the report that contains all these forms of objective knowledge of death, which I'm not suggesting aren't important, of course they are. From a first-person perspective, death has a completely different meaning and value. Science treats objects only in the sense that they are measurable and quantifiable, and thereby suitable to a causal explanation. But the meaning of a human life is not quantifiable. Medicine sits between these two perspectives because it is both an art and a science. Sitting between them, however, can also reveal a tension. The more medicine views itself as a science, the less it sees the human value and significance of death. This tension is perhaps the most visible in the use of medical technology to prolong the process of dying, such that it can be rightly argued that medicine is preventing people from dying well. What medical technology is putting off or preventing is death as a fact. There is a different way of thinking about dying as a process that is completed by death as a fact. Dying, or being towards death, as Heidegger describes it, taking up a long tradition in Western philosophy, is part of my life and not apart from it. Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher, names it learning to die, and is one of the spiritual exercises of Hellenistic philosophy. The others, if you want to know, are learning to live, learning to dialogue, learning to read. I wish my students would have that. It is only in facing my own mortality that I can become who I am and live my life as my own. I cannot experience my death as a fact. And even if I can experience the death of another, I cannot experience their own death. I can, however, relate to my own death as a possibility within my life. Being towards death as relational is part of my life and not apart from it. My death can give meaning and value to my life, rather than just a fearful fact or event that ends my life and which I attempt to put off for as long as possible. As soon as we are born, Heidegger writes, a rather cheerful statement, we are dying. I think for me, one of the really important aspects of this report and what the Commission has really emphasized is this relational meaning and value of death. And that this is what we have lost in the medicalization of death. And of course, this has extraordinary economic consequences as well. The amount of resources that we in the richest countries put in just extending people's life, prolonging, dying. It is not only my own death that has significance for me, but also the death of the other, even if I cannot experience their death for them. Who has not met someone who has not been shattered by the death of another? The death of a child, for example, might have more importance to you than your own death, such that you would willingly substitute yourself for them. This report has been written to remind us that death is not just a medical fact, but is a relation to ourselves and to others, which give meaning and value to our lives. I'm doing well. I haven't improvised. I've got like 3 minutes, but now I'm talking about how much time I've got left, wasting this precious time. Yet, it also alludes to, perhaps in a less direct way, to a different tension, which can compare to the first one I described. If my death and the death of intimate others concern me, then this should not be the cause of us forgetting the senseless death of those exposed to social violence, which already deprives them of a meaningful life. If this report rightly stresses the importance of a meaningful death, we should not forget this senseless, anonymous death. If the first death requires a relational commitment beyond the medicalization of death, then the response to this other death is an ethical demand for justice, for those who have been stripped of their humanity, such that dying their own death is no longer a possibility. This social violence is present in the report in its recognition of the climate crisis and global and social economic injustice. But I was particularly struck by the testimony of Mpo Tutu van Furth, who asks us to remember the social violence that robbed death of any value during apartheid in South Africa, and still robs the lives of Black African Americans. To do justice to this other death, we must recognize the social violence that is its cause. If a dignified death is the opposite of a medicalized death, then there are those who have already been robbed of their dignity. I did it 10 seconds after 10 minutes. Thank you.
I'm going immediately. All right, I wasn't sure if you were responding. I'm going to demonstrate slightly less rigor, I think, maybe with the timekeeping.
2 minutes.
Yeah, I was told by Robin very clearly that I had 2 minutes to speak, so obviously I've ordered my thoughts under 5 different categories, different approaches. I should explain that some of the work that we were doing on the Waiting Times project was a long piece of engaged work with Hospice Care, which is a charity operating in Devon, and we're working out of the working in partnership with the Honiton Day Hospice, doing a series of storytelling, story sharing sessions with everyone who was, and this is quite important, with everyone who was there, if that makes sense. So it wasn't that we were just working with service users. We had these storytelling groups that became a kind of self-constituting community that included people who might be described as service users, people who might be described as relatives and carers, people who might be the health carers there, and ourselves. I just say that to explain that's kind of that's the kind of piece of work that we did, and I was thinking this amazing kind of document in relation to the work that we'd done, and I wanted to kind of group my thoughts broadly under these 5 categories that seem to also conveniently come out of the engagement work that we were doing, which were exchange, community, medicine, representations, and power. And I want to think through those specifically with the kind of anecdotal data, and both those words are in kind of scare quotes, that comes through the act of engagement. And while I'm doing that, I'm also trying to hold in my head, and I'd really love to hear Robin talk to this, but also, and would love to hear everyone's thoughts on this really, because there seem to be two signs. As a semiotician, I like to pull signs out of anything and everything, and that's how I can grasp some kind of meaning. And I noticed, for me at least, death, dying, and grief sort of circulating as this phrase, a kind of triadic relationship there that I wasn't entirely sure what work that was doing compared to another triad which came around, which was illness, dying, which I'm thinking is one point of it, and death and grief as the others, and the shift of priority when illness, dying, which I think were the one same thing really, even though separated by a comma, meant when it was illness, dying, death and grief, compared to death, dying and grief, and what was standing in for what to make what kind of meaning, which I think is also there in those shifts between the subjective and the objective, and the kind of, I feel like there's at least three perspective points that we might want to take on that. The exchange, the question of exchange, really fascinated me and troubles me a lot. And I really enjoyed that passage, Robin, that we were also talking about yesterday, about which you managed to sneak in past the Lancet on Levinas, and the gift of death. And it spoke very strongly to something that came through in the work that we were doing, where we began to notice that we were, in the storytellings that were taking place, we were absolutely engaged in that kind of a kind of mutual gift giving, where the time was a gift across to all the different participants, but the gifts were incommensurable with each other and were different things. And the time that we generated in the sessions together became a kind of, used again, hallowed time in a very sort of skeptical and askance way, but it became on the one hand a unified time, but obviously once we started to look at what those little units of time within that time meant to the individuals, there was something that couldn't be exchanged across them. There were people who were telling stories of the summation of a certain narrative of their life that had no future narrative in which they were an active agent. And then there were other people who were able to engage in the same story narrative in the same space at the same time, but where they also, even if only implicitly, had themselves projected as an agent into the future. And that's, absolutely spoke to that Heidegger's bold and clear statement of, no one can live your death for you. But more than that, I think it spoke to a refute and challenge to ideas of exchange. It felt like there was something here about what really time was and the preciousness of time that couldn't have kind of come out in a kind of clearer relief, and except in these moments of incommensurable time between those maybe dying and those future dead versus those who because they weren't caught in a narrative of dying, were able to ignore the fact that they too are also future dead. I mean, we're all arguably moving towards in other words. I mean, not me, I should say. I'm on Elon's list. I'm right at the top of the Methuselah program. That we're all moving towards that same destination. And I think because it's a common phrase to kind of, or a common position to sort of argue that we're in a death-denying culture, which, when I think of those signs of death, dying, and grief, I don't think it is that we're in a death-denying culture. I think we're phenomenally comfortable with death. I think we're phenomenally uncomfortable with dying. That's the thing that's alarming, that people can, and that's why the COVID statistics, I think, were whilst they generated a certain type of anxiety, I think they also generated a certain type of kind of cultural collective calm as well. like a bunch of people who are dead as numbers, it can be massively reassuring to the individual looking at that number, because you know you're not in it at that moment in time. And that's a very reassuring position to find myself in. Yeah, so I think with that question of exchange, I want to kind of move from that into this thing about community, because I'm really, the engaged work really made us anxious about this, because we did create a community through this work, a type of community, and the community there was definitely, and we understood it's temporary in at least two different ways. Temporary because of the impending mortality of some of the people involved in it, but also in a more banal way because of the impending end date of our work. What we didn't realize was that COVID was going to cut through that entirely and totally destroy the community by bringing a more abrupt end to the work that we were doing. We were planning a whole series of kind of extended pieces of kind of legacy work that would turn into a kind of a sort of set of resources and a program that would be continued in the hospice, but also shut down that day hospice as well. But more brutally, and to speak to the kind of invisibility of death, it hastened the end of life for many of the participants. And our experience, the researchers from the waiting times, our experience of how those deaths took place compared to the dying that we had been witness to and kind of collaborators in was utterly brutal. I don't say that to kind of get sympathy or anything, but it was utterly brutal, because what we had was we could only, because of certain data protection laws as understood by the hospice, which I don't think was actually correct, we could only get this spreadsheet through regularly of who we could write to engage in an online workshop. And as we went along, and there was a lag in it, every time there were more of the people who had like a cross or shaded in a particular color on this spreadsheet. And so we gradually just saw the deaths emerge as an ever-changing spreadsheet, which is a horrendous reduction of these lives that we'd lived richly in this space with, the deaths that we'd been kind of, part of a group of people who were kind of curating and expressing and sharing that. It was an utterly horrendous and brutal way of coming up against death. I think for everyone, and then it made the final made that final kind of sharing event utterly impossible as well. So that was a detour that I hadn't really meant to take. But what that made me think about was and it's a question really strongly to you, Robin, because I see the stuff about a community that has to be in some sort of dialectical relationship with this sort of this respect for the possibilities and lack of possibilities of certain types of exchange, right? We're kind of saying, in a way, there's death shows us that the kind of dominant modes of exchange are are our dominant ordering myths, and they're not a kind that we're naturalizing, but they aren't actually really kind of natural categories. Okay, and death is exposing this, or is the gift of seeing that. And a community needs to be there that both kind of makes possible the acknowledgement of that, but also is kind of informed by what that lack of possibility of exchange says. And I'm just wondering, those communities can't be just dreamt up. And the Kerala example that you gave, and you immediately framed it as this is a kind of communist kind of political economy. Yeah. That seems to me a sort of vital leap that when you're operating within the UK context becomes absolutely impossible. From here to there anyway. How much time have I got left? And have I got any time left?
None, no.
None at all. That's all right.
Okay, don't worry.
The other 18 to 20 points will naturally emerge in the conversation. Okay. Lovely. Well,
It was a good way to end. And I'm glad you picked up on that loving us passage. That was my favorite part too. So I want to talk about that in question time as well. But thank you, Michael. That was great. So Megan, are you ready to give us your comments, please?
I am, and I have to say I haven't timed myself at all.
Okay,
but
it's 1:15 and we have the room till 2:30, so there's no.
No, and having said that, it's very unlikely And I'm not a philosopher by background. I mean, I've told Katrina and Robin, it amuses me that I have a PhD in system science, whatever that might mean. So for me, what I'd really like to do is, as I was thinking about this, and I just felt so appreciative in reading that report. Yeah, it just captured so many dimensions that seemed so vital to life. And it struck me that what I wanted to do was try and bring together relationality and systemicity, if there is such a word, being systemic. So, you know, it really struck me when I was reading the early piece, Robin, and bringing in the work of Emmanuel Levinas, how influenced I've been in thinking about relationship as the primary unit of analysis and change rather than the individual. And I was just thinking again of Marilyn Strathern's work as an anthropologist. So she's, I mean, that beautiful piece that she wrote, the relation, issues in complexity and scale. And this is a quote from her. She says, at the heart of systems are persons dealing with one another. The systems they create for themselves being second order manifestations of their primary human ability to make relationships. And then she says the concept of relation can be applied to any order of connection and applies to relationship with the human and non-human world. And then I looked at Levinas's, the piece, you know, Levinas's quote about the relation itself is the value, and that the nature of this relation is a gratuitous movement of presence. And it just really struck me that the medicalization, the process of medicalization, actually is a process of dehumanizing and actually atomizing and breaking relationship. And it really struck me, and I was also struck by Mpho Tutu, because, you know, we've been in South Africa since I am South African. And the whole concept of Ubuntu and being here at the time of Desmond Tutu's death and how that was celebrated. So standing outside St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town and watching people coming in singing a cappella tributes to Desmond Tutu and Mpho Tutu's speech, and the sort of the self-deprecating humor that went with that, and the contextualizing of death in the context of the complex life that constitutes South Africa and has always constituted South Africa. And then the whole notion of Ubuntu that Desmond Tutu so often cited, you know, that notion of I am because we are, we have no existence outside of an interdependent relationship. And then, you know, just looking at the report, it so struck me. So if we're talking about systems change and changing death systems, it's the issue of certainty and control, and that the challenge that the report mentions to reductionist and linear approaches, that when we're trying to rebalance death systems, that the whole struggle with control and the desire for control. So my background is an applied linguist. So at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I was a mainstream linguist, and then I taught communication in healthcare in the medical faculty, and then got into how do we transform curricula and curriculum knowledge in the transition to post-apartheid South Africa. So very much attentive to language power and the power of language. And I just realized, and it reminded me, Robin and Katrina, of the challenge of our work with WHO last year around trying to build a research paradigm around relational community engagement and what that meant, and how to help people manage the necessary uncertainty that comes with loosening a hold on professional disciplines and professional knowledge, and not just the medicalization, but the professionalization. And so that struggle with not knowing, and somehow the need to sort of, what did the language of the report, to attach medically manageable and quantifiable measures to what is an entirely subjective human experience and the immediate reduction of that experience and the meaning of that experience. And it just really got me into, for me, all of my work is how do we work with this thing about not knowing. So when you're trying to effect systems change, you don't take on the whole system. You actually do pockets of experimentation where people become comfortable with not knowing, that capacity to actually work with inherent uncertainty as we come to learn together to reshape the debt system. That's going to be critical. And of course, the vehicles for that are exactly what we've been talking about: storytelling, story sharing, narrative, dialogue, generative conversation, all of the things that the medical profession often balks at and finds most difficult because it actually foregrounds first-person experience and it validates that as legitimate evidence and data in the process of trying to bring about systemic change. And it is that, for me, I think it's all these bridging practices of conversation, storytelling and listening. All of these are the vehicles, I think, for accepting our radical relational interconnectedness, both with one another and with the natural world. And if I think about the work that's being done in India, not Kerala so much, but if you look at the Nigerian public intellectual philosopher, academic Bayo Kamalafi, his core work is hosting grief circles in India. That is the current work that he sees as an entirely necessary work of our time in the process of healing. So I was just so fascinated as an applied linguist and as having taught communication in healthcare in, by the way, an all-Black medical faculty in an all-white university, a uniquely South African phenomenon. CBICO was a product of this medical faculty. These are not difficult conversations. They're actually conversations that are the lifeblood of relationality and a non-medicalized approach to holistic care that is actually concerned with the whole person in life, in dying, and in death. And then I was just so struck, having done a lot of work in scenarios and reflexive futuring work. You know that you ended with scenarios. The report ends with potential scenarios, and scenarios are narratives. They're stories of plausible, relevant futures that have their seeds in the present. It's no coincidence that they're narrative. So having worked in a post-apartheid transition with the Monfleur scenarios, they're ways of capturing the public imagination around what's possible. So they are possible futures, and it's no coincidence that Kees van der Heijden, one of the forerunners of scenario thinking, his book is called The Art of Strategic Conversation. It's how do we invite people into these conversations that allow vulnerability, and it's vulnerability on all sides. It's not only those who are dying that experience vulnerability. It's all of those surrounding them. And often the medicalization is a protection against vulnerability, but in particular, our own. So for me, I think the capacity for reflexive futuring, how we co-shape together the kind of just equitable futures and the reshaping of the so-called death system, so that we, what we talk about, what in the report talks about the basis for building communal or relational autonomy rather than individual autonomy. I think that that is the core work. And from my perspective, I think that these are what will give life to the 5 principles that undergird the beautiful, realistic utopia that the report describes, and that I found incredibly heartening, because we're not talking about scaling anything up. We're talking about scaling across deep practices, deep processes, deep relationality, as we ask together the question, what if community were possible? So those are my reflections.